on behalf of the Alumni Association, a warm welcome. We're extremely happy to see that a large number of you have taken time out on a Saturday evening to join us for these three scintillating sessions, preceded by our keynote address. This evening's program is the first of many more events to be organized by the Alumni Association. The aim of these programs is to create meaningful and nuanced dialogue on contemporary issues of law and legal education. Many have asked why this is being done at this point of time and what is the objective. The current governing body assumed office in March 2020. Immediately, we were confronted with a few pressing developments relating to our alma mater, and we decided to start engaging with various stakeholders in order to determine the best way forward. We also had our own list of areas where the Alumni Association needs to work harder. The NLSIU is going through challenging times. There is reduction in state funding, ever-increasing competition from newer law schools. And we felt that this was a good time to initiate discussions on various aspects and to get the ball rolling on action towards change. Further, the present pandemic has thrown new curveballs at all academic institutions in terms of delivery of education, conduct of examinations. Hence, we curated our three panels: infrastructure and investment, diversity and inclusion, and technology's role in the future of legal education. We believe that these three areas represent key and topical themes from a short as well as long-term perspective. Our excellent speakers here tonight represent diverse experiences, expertise, and are well known in their respective fields. We thank them for taking out the time to speak today, and we hope that the ensuing discussions will see participation from an even more varied group. The second objective of these events is to foster the feeling of community and work on increasing the way in which we can give back to our alma mater. We therefore hope to learn and be advised by the panelists and through audience participation on how NLS alumni can give back and have more engaging interactions with the institutions years after graduation. We are hopeful that some action points will emerge from the deliberations here tonight for the Alumni Association as well as other stakeholders. Speaking of community, there is a sense that the current Alumni Association is exclusionary in many ways. As a result of the way our trustee is formed, membership of the Alumni Association has been restricted to Indian citizens from the LLB program. But the informal NLS community is fully inclusive and encourages participation from everybody. We assure you that making a more inclusive Alumni Association through both formal and informal channels is the topmost priority for us since we have assumed office. The Alumni Association is in the preparatory stages of a number of other initiatives, one of which is an alumni newsletter. You will hear from us shortly on both these initiatives. Now, without further delay, I take great privilege in introducing our keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Sudhir Krishnaswamy. There is hardly a current student or alumni who is not aware that Dr. Krishnaswamy is the current Vice Chancellor of NLS. He teaches political philosophy and politics in India, law and governance, legal system reform. He also serves as the Director of the Distance Education Department at NLSIU. Dr. Krishnaswamy is a widely published author, both in India and internationally. He completed his law degree from the NLS in 1998 and subsequently completed his BCL and Doctor of Philosophy in Law degrees from the University of Oxford. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Mani, and good evening, everyone. It's an absolute delight to be at this panel and to start things off. It's a timely initiative for the Alumni Association, given the recent reinvigoration, the election, and a new governing body. So I'm glad to be having this conversation with you at this time. But it's also timely for the university as it transitions from what it has been doing very successfully for about 30 years to setting some wider ambitions, some higher ambitions, if one may add, and chart some new directions for its future. So let me I'm going to take just a few minutes, 5 or 6 minutes, as we had discussed, to do two things. To just give you a sense of what this transition of the university might be, and open up a conversation about this, And second, to talk about the stakeholder structure of the university when it was conceived and what it might look like in the future. So let me start with the university. So I think many of you know that there's a curious element to the naming of our university. Most academic proposals for a new law experiment always spoke of a national law school. The first large article on this in the Journal of the Indian Law Institute talked about a national law school to be set up at JNU, of all places, but a national law school, never a university. As we know, that proposal meandered and languished for several years before it was finally adopted and pushed through in Bangalore, with the Karnataka state government suggesting the formation of a new university, hence the National Law School of India University. As things turned out, the early imagination of the university was really as a national law school. We ran a small program, the BA LLB program, an immensely successful one at that. We took about 80 students, smaller numbers in the first few batches, but we have pretty much stuck at doing the same thing. 32 years later, we still receive 80 students in the BA LLB program. We've had a small LLM program of about 50 students, and we continue to sustain that program. And the only innovation is one that we introduced a few years ago, which was the introduction of a master's in public policy program. So as far as academic programs go, the university has been doing much the same for 32 years. Does it warrant the name a university? Some might contest that. And I suppose that one of the big transitions that the National Law School will go through is about the expansion of its academic programs as it moves from being, intellectually conceived as a school to really fulfilling the needs of a university. A university also imposes a couple of other both burdens and obligations on us. First, that we should be a hub in the production of useful knowledge, both for this country and beyond. The research function of a university, engaging with the world, doing a rigorous, careful research and producing that knowledge is not one that the National Law School has emphasized upon. As it transitions to becoming a full-fledged university, the emphasis on this research function will grow. And third, we've had, and we're all grateful for that, even at our founding, had a very strong public sense of what this university was meant to be about. We were told, much like at the founding of the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad, that you're not just interested in business, you're interested in management, insofar as such an education can help a developing country. In that sense, I think all of us have grown up with the ethos that the National Law School is interested in the preservation of India as a constitutional republic in the 21st century, in the 20th, when we were founded, and now in the 21st, and should be an institution at the forefront of that enterprise of building a strong republic. So all of these are worthwhile goals of a university, and clearly what we must do more of and do better in the years ahead. So let me say something about the alumni in a slightly different way, which is to talk about the early founding. And if one pays attention to the stakeholder structure of the university when it was founded, you would notice that there were 4 stakeholders at the table. It was academic law teachers who were really pushing the proposal for this university, and the Bar Council they found in the Bar Council of India a statutory authority that was willing to advocate the cause. They found in Supreme Court, in some Supreme Court judges, patrons to that cause, and in the government of Karnataka, a benefactor who was willing to both grant land and marginally support the university as it grew. This stakeholder structure at conception is encrusted into the statutory, the statutory form of NLS. Now, where do the alumni come in? Now, as this law school transitions to becoming a full-fledged university, the alumni become a critical stakeholder. And I believe that in this transition, the alumni might even become the lead stakeholder. But to do that, we must not begin by emphasizing the form of that engagement, by which I mean representation in the governing bodies or, or the like. I would much rather begin with the alumni demonstrating clearly to the world and to the current university stakeholders that they are the biggest contributors to this transition. And I don't mean when I say contribution, only financial contribution. I mean intellectual contribution. I mean labor, as we often find that we really need just your time, and the financial support that will help make this transition a successful one and one that we can all be proud of. So let me stop there. I think I've just lost a little more than my 8-9 minutes. Back to you, Mani.
Thank you, sir. Before we start our first panel, we also have Vignesh here. He is the newly elected president of the Student Bar Association to address all our panelists and audience on the current state of affairs. Vignesh, over to you.
Sorry. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you're from. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you so much to the alumni for giving me an opportunity to speak on this wonderful platform. So today, I just wish to broadly outline some of the important things that I feel we as a university need to do going forward, especially into the future, and some of the things that we can do in order to help address these issues. So to lay out a little context, NLS this year, especially in the past 2-3 years, has become much more and more inclusive than we've ever noticed. NLS has seen more participation from students from tier 2, tier 3 cities and villages, and it's become a largely more inclusive body. However, there are still some issues that we need to address in order to ensure that, one, we become more inclusive, and two, we aim to adhere to the standards of excellence we aspire to set. So these two issues, I identify them to be: first, how do we become more inclusive? And second, how do we develop stronger coping mechanisms for students to, for students and alumni and all the three stakeholders to come together and help produce a more conducive curriculum. So with regard to first ensuring greater diversity, yes, as I mentioned, we are becoming more and more inclusive. However, I feel at least two issues on the count of inclusivity remain. One is as to how the sex ratio of the university is definitely getting more and more skewed as we speak. In the past 2-3 batches, it's become larger than 2:1. And in the last batch, which came in the batch of 2019, it was close to 3:1. So that is certainly worrying. And however, although we may not be able to do something directly as a university to help address this, I feel we do need to have more conversations on how we can at least try and remedy this issue and provide greater representation. Second is, I feel the inclusion of Northeast students has reduced. We used to have at least 5 to 6 students per batch. That is definitely reducing. My batch didn't have any students from the Northeast. And so we also need to understand how we can ensure greater geographical representation as well. Second, to my more important point that I mainly want to talk about with regard to coping mechanisms, I identify there being 3 facets to coping mechanisms. First, the academic; second, the financial part; and third, the larger idea of mental well-being. So, and there are 3 stakeholders, as I mentioned. First are the peers, second is the administration, and third is the alumni. So how do these 3 stakeholders ensure that these 3 facets of coping mechanisms are addressed? First is, I think the peers should be able to provide robust academic support and help out the students. We're already trying to do something like this. For example, last trimester, we had peer support sessions conducted by students of each batch, discussing difficult concepts and doubts much before the exam, and also to generate interest in a particular subject. And second, we look at the role of the administration, which is identifying and addressing the issues of accessibility. yes, it is true that we've seen the greatest numbers of participation across students in terms of attendance and examinations. However, I also feel it's not just about the numbers. We also need to be looking at the quality of access that the students are having and identify ways in which we can address this. One of the most important issues that exists as a threshold difficulty is the issue of English. Many, perhaps not many, some students, as soon as they enter into university, face some sort of issue with the English language and difficulties with communication and social skills. And you see, these issues end up manifesting into all their forms of interaction with the university, be it coping up with academics, be it reaching out to their peers and interacting, be it getting necessary organizational skills the university tries to inculcate you with. All of these suffers as a result of the lack of threshold abilities. So hence, we should improve our infrastructure to be able to address these issues of inclusivity and these issues of accessibility. And finally, also address the issue of mental health from behalf of the administration. The peers do help. We also had peer support, peer support group sessions and listening groups. However, having institutional support in this regard is useful, and we hope to have greater conversations moving forward. And finally, we also need to identify meaningful ways in which we can provide greater financial support to the students, because I feel with the COVID-19 crisis, many families might have been hit, and ensuring that they don't worry so much about about being able to study or being able to continue with NLS is also one of our main responsibilities that we need to discharge. And finally, I want to discuss the role of the alumni as a stakeholder and how we as the SBA intend to facilitate this process a lot more. One is that I would definitely say that we've had vibrant interactions with the alumni. I was on the Moot Court Society last year, and I've reached out to alumni for almost every source of support that we've required, be it drafting the problem, be it judging rounds, checking memos, and so on. However, what we wish to do this year is to ensure that we create a more structured form of approach to how the alumni interact with the university. First is we wish to revamp the internships and alumni outreach cell. So through this, we hope the alumni can help with providing career advice, reaching advice on where to intern, what is adequate internship etiquette, and so on. And given how diverse the paths of our alumni have been, I think it's also great to have advice on what are the other non-legal options we have and exploring that. And finally, we also want to ensure that we facilitate greater informal conversations between the alumni and the students, ensuring that the alumni don't just give us financial support or so on, but are also there to mentor the students, be able to just connect with the students and interact with them, so that even everyone knows we have some sort of common shared goals and some sort of common shared struggles. And I feel exploring that and discussing that will actually help. So these are just some of the ideas that I had going forward, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to speak. I realize I've overshot by a little time, but thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I would give it over to the next speaker, or head on to the panel for the discussion.
Thank you, Vignesh.
Thank you.
Our first panel tonight is on infrastructure and investment. The session will be moderated by Mr. Murali Neelkantan. He is a 1996 batch alumnus of NLSIU. He is also one of the editors of An Idea of a Law School, Ideas from the Law School, a collection of essays on legal education and the legal profession.
Thank you all. You will notice that the panel looks slightly different from what was advertised. But I'm delighted that we had Justice Sarunan of the Madras High Court and Mr. Vikramjit Banerjee, who agreed to participate at really short notice when another member of the panel pulled out at the last minute. I think for those who know the alumni, this should be seen as one of the qualities of the alumni, willing to step in whenever the university or the alumni association has just had to make a phone call. So perhaps it's a message for the Vice Chancellor and the SBA that all you need to do is call, and somebody from the alumni will step up and help out. There are three main topics really that we will look at. First, what is the vision for the National Law School? It was a novel idea in 1980s and 1990s, But those of us from that generation also know that the Maruti 800 is not a desirable car these days. So we look at, has the legal profession changed? What should the new law school model be? Should it be more open to public? Are we looking at legal education for all? So what does NLSIU need to do to reinvent itself? Umakant?
Yeah, thanks, Murli. And I think the question that you've asked is a very valid one because, law school started over 3 decades ago, and there's been a lot of change thereafter. And if we look at it even from the country's perspective, law school actually was conceived in the pre-economic liberalization era, in a sense. A lot of things have changed after that, not just economically, but also politically in the Indian context. So one way to think about what you asked is to consider where the legal profession is headed, and then to consider where the legal education should go, because in a sense, legal education is a sort of a service provider or something that gives rise to those who go on to the legal profession. And what I would like to describe in recent days is something called disruptive innovation. And I think the legal profession has already started seeing disruptive innovation, but legal education, I think, is lagging a little behind. But many factors, including COVID-19, will force legal education to engage in that legal disruptive innovation. And I'll give you just 3 points that I have in mind. They may be taken up later, but these are the 3 opportunities and challenges that an institution like NLS will have to consider. The first one is the challenge between globalization and localization. So legal profession is becoming more and more globalized. Transactions and litigation is becoming more cross-border in nature. But at the same time, we are facing a lot of local issues as well. So I think what NLS and other institutions need is the breadth to be able to deal with either ends of the spectrum and the various points in between, in terms of globalization as well as the local issues. So how do we educate students to appreciate this breadth between the two? I think is a very important perspective. The second is something that a third panel is going to look at, which is the impact of technology on legal education. Historically, I think the universities have been dinosaurs. Universities have been resistant. And I don't mean this to say NLS. All universities around the world have been the farthest when it comes to improvements in technology. But I think an episode like COVID-19 has forced people who are otherwise resistant to technology to use technology to deliver legal education. I think that's a game changer. The access that we will have to legal education, including to various other parts of society which may otherwise not be able to access legal education by coming to the institution, I think that reach is going to be pretty significant. There are issues with that. I'm not saying it's a magic that will work, but there are issues that need to be dealt with. But I think technology is an important thing, which I'm looking forward to for the third panel to think about. And the third point that I have is something I've said before, which is the whole legal services is undergoing a process of unbundling. So who is a lawyer today, or who can appear before a court or a tribunal, who can undertake a legal transaction? I think there's a lot of blurring of the boundaries over there. There are people like chartered accountants who are coming into the picture. There are people, like patent agents. Depending on the area of law that you're looking at, there are various different people coming into the picture. So how do you deal with the blurring of the boundaries is important. And I think law is going to become not just a study of law, but law and something else. It's going to be interdisciplinary. It's going to be data-driven. It's going to be a study of society, economics and so on. So I think how do we prepare our students for that? So I think these are the 3 futuristic aspects that an institution like NLS might have to consider in what I would call the state of disruptive innovation that we are in currently.
Thank you, Umakant. Sarsu, you've heard from Umakant, you've heard from the Vice Chancellor. What's your take on the future that we see of law school? Are we going to see law for all? Are we going to be so immersed in society that everybody will have access to the law? Is that the future of law school?
I'll start where Umakant left out. I mean, when law school began, it was to create an institution which was only focused on law. A law university was something which was very unusual at that time. And I think now we've probably come a full circle. And as Umakant pointed out, we need to be more multidisciplinary. And we are moving in that direction. So we have more courses. I think one obvious choice, I could point out is our MPP program, our Masters in Public Policy program, where we have mature students who've done degrees in other different disciplines who come together to study public policy. If you look at the way that we are being judged on the NAAC score, NAAC score, we do need to move to a more multidisciplinary format and offer more courses other than pure law courses. Now, when we talk about accessibility, I think there are several issues. Vignesh pointed out finances, for instance, among others. I think that continues to be a huge issue for us in terms of how we raise finances and how how we are able to do our outreach programs depends on the money that we have. Accessibility for students are important. If you look at our scholarship program, we've made sure that no student has fallen through just because they could not afford to pay. We're trying to work out a bank loan process in order to make this better. And certainly this is one area in which alumni can help. As of now, I think the scholarship interest which comes from alumni scholarships in law school is about 3 lakhs per year. And I think, we can definitely improve on that score. In terms of accessibility, we have the distance education department, which has around, I think, 4,000 students at the moment. And so we have been able to reach out to a wide range of people in a wide range of courses, right from cyber law to consumer law to human rights to our mainstay, which is the Masters in Business Law. The other thing that we also need to do is to focus on making courses more meaningful for different groups of students in terms of internships and in terms of the way that opportunities come to them and how they're able to use opportunities. We need to make law more open to mature students. We are thinking of a 3-year LLB, for instance, which will allow students from other disciplines to come in, which will have maybe engineers or chartered accountants or someone else who wants to do a law degree. So I think that is the way forward for us if we are talking about making law more accessible. Many of our centers also do legal literacy programs. Our students also do legal literacy programs. Our research centers do legal literacy programs. So law for all, I think, will be limited to legal literacy. But we are trying to reach out in very many new directions, I think. And I see that as a way forward.
Sarsu, that's very helpful. I think it leads into the next question is, if you want to do all of these things, what is the kind of infrastructure that we need? So why don't you answer that, and then we'll go to Markant.
All right. First and foremost, we need faculty. I think as of now, if you look at our expenses, the large bulk of expenditure is on staff salaries, not just faculty, but staff salaries. But we do need good faculty who will be recruited to handle many of these programs, who would contribute to research, and who would contribute to institution building, because the time has come that we build in new directions. In order to have more courses, to have more students, by increasing our intake, we will need other kinds of infrastructure like library buildings. In order to improve our research, we will need to have research grants. As of now, we are not in a position to offer faculty a penny for their research. They have to find their own funding. We need to have a better scholarship policy. It may be in terms of endowments by alumni. I know the batch of 94, for instance, gave us an endowment last year. But it could also be in terms of practical help, like helping students find internship opportunities. In some cases, finding them a place to stay or buying them a ticket, without which that internship may not be accessible to a student. It is also in terms of academic input. Increasingly, we are seeing that universities that prosper do so by tying up with the industry. Many of you are in the industry, so we are looking forward to having better ties with alumni. On an average, every year we've had about 10 alumni come to offer courses, new courses in new areas, as small as 2-week, 1-credit courses, which are no longer available, to a new model of intensive courses that we experimented with in this academic year, to longer term engagements with us. And we would like to also ensure that alumni hold itself up to the same levels of responsibility as faculty. Generally, we've had fantastic feedback from students on alumni courses. We've had a couple of instances where we had trouble with alumni getting back to us on evaluation, etc. But that has been just one or two instances. So, these are many ways in which I think alumni could contribute, and, and also infrastructure that we do need, even in the short term, if we are to move in a multidisciplinary direction at all.
I hear you, Sarsu, but having listened to Umakant, and I think the general sense that we have, when someone makes a pitch for another library, I think you lose a lot of interest amongst the alumni. How many more square feet of library do you need? So I guess the conversation needs to happen with you to think of what we need to build for the next 10 years. We can't be building the 1980s model of, more construction. I don't think the alumni are going to be, let's say, sympathetic to that view. We don't need more buildings. We probably need to put the money where it actually makes something out of it. And these days, buildings don't make money. But that feeds into, I think, a few things that Umakant had on what you were emphasizing on, which is what can alumni do with providing intellectual infrastructure? Umakant?
Yeah. So I think and I think I'm glad that we're having this conversation with a lot of alumni participating here. And, some sources have kind of indicated that there are three ways by which alumni can participate. One, by giving their treasure; the second, giving their talent; and the third, by giving their time. And I think we've spoken a lot about the talent and the time, but we've probably undermined or understated the importance of the treasure. And for that, I think we probably need a much more focused, and I think Vignesh mentioned that, focused and structured engagement with the alumni. And if you look at internationally, clearly, even in a place like the US, where the universities get a lot of money, and I'm raising this because where are we today? Today, we are in a stage where the government funding is going down. We can't ask the students for a huge hike in the fees because they're not going to be able to afford it. So where else can the the deficit be filled from? And I think the alumni has to play a big role there. And from what Sarsu mentioned, I think while there have been some measures that have been taken on the part of the alumni, they seem to be quite inadequate to meet with the needs of the institution. So I think we need to think about physical infrastructure. We need to think about digital infrastructure as well, online resources, libraries, and so on. So where do we get that from? And I think there are many areas where law school can engage more with the alumni, and this initiative is a great start to that. In many of you who've studied in other institutions around the world will be very familiar with this experience, where you keep getting bombarded with the university that you've graduated from for financial help. Now that's one model. It might work in a place like the US, where it's even in a place like the US, with all that, apparently only 9% of the alumni actually donate or give money back to the institution. But I think that's a very key way of getting that deficit in place. And to me, there are many things in building infrastructure, digital infrastructure, scholarships, research centers, which the Vice Chancellor spoke about. I think the alumni can contribute either directly or by using their networks and resources to bridge that gap. And I think what we need is a sustained engagement. So maybe there needs to be calls from the institution saying, this is what we need, as Murli mentioned, these are the needs of the university. And then once the financial assistance has been provided, maybe a kind of a reporting mechanism, which many other universities do, saying that this is how we've used the funds. I think that builds a lot of engagement, credibility, and interest among the alumni to the institution. I think the financial part is only one thing, but it can be a lead to something with much more emotional in terms of the bonding with the university. So I think that kind of interaction over a period of time will be very important, in addition to the talent and time, which I won't talk about because a lot has already been mentioned by Sarsu and others as well. So the point I'm trying to make is, maybe I think given the constraints that are there in the institution, we we should definitely look to the alumni to do, to pitch in, like universities around the world are pretty openly doing it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Except, of course, we must be clear that the institution should be careful, not to, because, a lot of times the financial help can come with riders and constraints and so on. But I'm sure the institution will do a lot of due diligence to ensure that, that those don't happen. But otherwise, I think the alumni base is a very important resource for meeting the financial needs of the law school, especially for the students who are not able to, a deserving student should not be left behind. And I think the alumni should do whatever is possible through a more structured and sustainable engagement going forward.
Thank you, Umakant. Could I please ask the Additional Solicitor General, Mr. Vikramjit Banerjee, to pitch in now? I think you'll realize that we've heard from the academics all the things that they need, all the things that they think we should be doing as alumni. But the reality also is that the litigation bar in the early years doesn't really have the money to spare, doesn't have the time to spare. And therefore it falls on, I think, the older alumni and leaders of the bar of a particular generation to try and step in and pitch in. As you know, that during, let's say, the 25 years ago, we had the leaders of the bar come to law school, teach, participate, help financially as well as with their time. So is there a chance, Mr. Banerjee, that we can restart that tradition in some way, or is that for the old times? We are in technology era and people are unwilling to spare that time anymore.
Well, thanks, Murli. I think also put a gun on my head and got me to participate in this, and Murli is. But what you flagged is a good idea. There is no issues about that. But before I start off, I think I would like to flag mark one or two things. I think number one, finances. We all know even Harvard. I don't know how much Harvard actually generates from financial contributions from ex-students. I think that's a very small percentage. I think the largest percentage, if I remember, from Harvard comes from endowment model, which we can't practice is because we don't have that sort of a endowment. Harvard also relies on projects. And this is one thing which I sort of see. I think I would want law school to pitch for more projects. There are think tanks, legal think tanks, which are doing these huge projects for the government. But somehow or the other, law school enjoys these think tanks and does very niche kind of work. And in fact, let me be very clear. There is a feeling amongst certain sections across the board, and take me as representative of the government voice, but I'm saying that there is a feeling amongst certain sections of people in the polity that law school, there are two problems of law school. One, they find it extremely elitist, and they find it doesn't cater to wide amount of people, large amounts of students. So it would want the law school to cater to a larger, wider audience. You can't have a law school in India catering only to 70 or 80 people in class. I really don't think, I can't see the economics of it. I can't see the politics of it. I can't see the sociology of it. So you have to get in more students. That's one. Two, I also think there is, and in the morning when I was sort of discussing with some of my friends, it almost seems to be law school, it has a very niche, for the want of a better word, and I'm using it approximately, very specific ideology in which, sort of which it revolves around. So where is, and there is not enough space for people who don't conform to that, especially people, and I'll be very, people of a conservative or for that matter, from the right, which skews the impression which law school has amongst large groups of people, which also has other repercussions across the board. And this is something which we should all sort of understand this. Of course, if you talk about that, we need to maintain our independence and we need to be this enclave, well then, you have to have finances to finance that enclave, and good luck to you. But my crux of the entire issue is, if you want whole-scale participation and full-scale participation, then you also have to step out. There has to be some sort of accommodation, and it can't be completely detached from the realities which exist outside. I mentioned MBL is possibly the largest money-spinning course in distance learning education, but MBL was at the time at the formation of the university. Where are the courses now? Where are the other courses now? The world has changed. There are whole loads of things which have changed. Murli flagged a very important issue about libraries and about digital libraries. I think that is also something which we should see. I think at the crux of it, if we get out of the fact that the law school is a completely elitist institution, it caters to creating a legal elite, and sort of ensure that merely, we use a rhetoric that we are for society, and we sort of promote a kind of politics which we push or have academic discussions, but actually in practice, it is of 70 people. And 70 people working in big law firms, 70 people working, expand it. And I'm sure you will be able to expand, one of the ways to expand it is to have student fees. People are willing to pay for it. If you have only 70 people, the fees will be higher. If you have a large number of people, then the fees will, to that extent, be commensurate. And of course, to an extent, you can ask for government, but to be, and this is something which, this question, which I was asking, this question was put forward to me. I said, where does law school discuss Indian jurisprudence? Where does law school discuss local languages, local needs? What is the input of on local issues of the law school? Law school is perceived to be this completely isolated thing. So now you exist in India, you exist in terms of a statute of a certain state. You have to accommodate the interest. How you do it is up to you. But if you want finances, these interests, these questions will have to be squarely addressed. And I do not think the law school addresses these issues.
Mr. Banerjee, that's a very interesting take, that law school's not really focusing on India enough, and that is also the point that I think Umakant was trying to make, that there is a tension between trying to be global and trying to be Indian, and which part of India. You're saying we're not catering to the more traditional Indian, we're catering to an elite Indian. But we still don't have an answer to a very important question, is these are all great things. If you take in more students, then we have Sarsu's question about having to build more hostels, build more infrastructure, which is money now that we need for what will pay out, let's say, in 10 years' time. If we go for more short-term money, which is increase the fees of the existing students, increase the fees of the MBL program, of the MPP program, we risk being exclusionary. So where is that model where we get some money to last now?
I get what you're saying. I think immediately what I think is, even if you want, and this is a question which I think all of you, which is the elephant in the room nobody is discussing, is there is a reluctance of the government to put forward its hands. And I marked as to what I actually, without actually taking all things in correct, I said what I had to.
Yeah.
I don't want to be explicit, but that's the impression we have. I think everybody in the government is interested in a center of excellence. Everybody's interested in and law school is an excellent institution. Law school is a place of national excellence. Everybody is interested. Everybody is welcoming of it. everybody wants the best for it. But, there is an impression among certain circles, and I don't want to specify it, that law school wants the benefit of it, but then wants to stand against it, do whatever it suits itself. I understand, I possibly understand if let me put it this way, the political undercurrents were more in consonance with feelings of people at the National Law School. But when that doesn't actually happen, for example, again, since we are discussing, and this is my view, and this is not a view as the additional Solicitor General.
Yeah, I understand.
When you have law school students getting arrested, demonstrating against government policy, and the president of the Bar Association, of course, we all are for student freedom, and students should be entitled to everything. But the fact is, it gives a certain impression. And I'm not saying you clamp down on students, I'm not saying that. But the fact is, there is a strong feeling that in any case, traditional conservative thought is not even heard or accounted for in either the academic criteria or for that matter, in and around law school. I'm sure it may not be in the interests of law school. It may not be in where it wants to see itself. Maybe it wants to see itself as a great globalist center of excellence. Good luck, all the best for it. But then when you need government help, then you have to put a step forward. And I've always advocated that. It's not that people have great admiration for the institution, but it also wants the institution to be to be a little bit more accommodating to, for the want of a better word, and I'm trying to use a very value neutral word, conservative thoughts.
But that's a good line. My question really was, when we take government money, as we've seen in the last few months, it comes with strings attached. So the Karnataka government wants local domicile requirements, for example.
Yes.
Now, that makes it no longer a national law school, makes it a state law school. So again, the model that we want, the funding that we get, has to be in line with our vision. So my worry with taking on something like this is that, are we now saying the National Law School is really a Karnataka Law College, by whatever name, and every state has its own National Law University, and we are not national anymore? So I find it a little difficult to accept when you say we are a national university, a national institution of excellence, national, and then we go to the state government, which says we need 25% of locals. We have differences, I'm sure, on what that local is, right or wrong.
If you want me to address that, I'll address that. But of course, I'm taking too much of time. There is Uma, there is Sarasu, so I just don't want to monopolize all the time. But my view on that is very simple. First of all, this question is right, I think, right before the courts at the present moment, when NLUD and its reservation is being challenged.
Correct.
So you'll get an answer to that very, very clearly as to which way the wind is blowing. I don't want to comment on something which is, but on my personal perception of the matter. My personal perception of the matter is this model which you're talking about, this great national institution across board, across the entire country, may have been valid when you were the only national law school. Now, every state has 2 national law schools. And that may be another reason why, what was flagged by the SCBA president. But that goes back to why aren't Northeastern people coming over to national law school? It may also be that they do find going to NUJS or going to the law school in Guwahati or Bhubaneswar more convenient. So you also have to ensure that, for better or for worse, this great, we are not the only institution which we were in the 80s. The world has changed. Politics of India has changed. And so, it is to be seen. And as it goes back to how we see ourselves, do we see ourselves as rooted enough or do we see ourselves above, in some ways, above the general population of India? If you want to be reflected and rooted enough, then you would have to take into interest, interest of Karnataka in maybe in teaching the academic subjects which you take in some sort of domicile representation. I remember very clearly if there was no domicile representation, at least there were substantial people from Bangalore who were day scholars when I started. How come this situation has today arisen? To me, if somebody is going to tell me that people from Bangalore are not any more qualified, or they're not any more up to scratch, I don't think I'd take that. And I've gone and said this at NUJS also when this arose. I think if a state is going to come up with a legislation, whatever may have been the intention right in the beginning, but the state is now coming up with the legislation, you're governed by that legislation. To that extent, if you have to, and you are in some ways short of finance and you want the state to contribute, you have to accept that there is a certain, of course, you can free up certain seats for national selection. Good, and that you can use them and for promoting excellence. But you have to reflect where you are from.
I like a good advocate, you avoided the question of senior leaders of the bar making a contribution. I will hold you to it another time, Mr. Banerjee. But Sarsu, what is the scale of what we need for the next 10 years? In money terms, how much money do we need? And somebody has to, as he said, Vikramji said, there is the elephant in the room. If 3 lakhs is not enough, is 30 lakhs enough? Are we talking 30 crores? I think there's a lot of alumni here, and the only way you're going to get support is if you come out and say, this is what we need, and then have 10 different ways of getting it. If you say we need 1 crore, then Mr. Banerjee will get someone knocking on his door, and the top, let's say 20 or 30 senior advocates will have people knocking on their doors and say, please write us a check for 10 lakhs each. And there you go. You got your money for this year. So what is the scale of the problem we're talking about here?
Well, that's, we are in the process of trying to figure out where we are headed over the next few years. And so to give you, a figure will be hard, but we are asking, and we would like the government to contribute, at least to the level that other governments have contributed, let us say to Orissa or to, to Maharashtra, which is about 350 crores to begin with. If we had that kind of money, we could start reimagining the way that our campus, prioritize things. But that's not a demand that I'm going to come to the alumni with. So I'd say, I don't know what a good ballpark figure could be. I think if you say maybe 10 crores, that might be a good beginning to start with.
Oh, Lord. That's it. Mr. Banerjee will make a few phone calls and we'll have it.
From the alumni.
Yes.
Mr. Banerjee is not.
But we want 350. Yeah.
That's a number to say.
See, that's what I'm saying. If you want it, then you have to live with the streets. Let's not be under to any impression.
Umakant,
you can't say, let me get a little bit, but there should be a little bit.
Umakant, could we?
And when that comes, live with the streets. As simple as that.
Last word, Umakant, what are the other ways that we can think of to raise money? What, apart from alumni writing checks, which is quite hard, what is it that others have done? Can we double the fees in the MBL program? Double the fees in the MPP program? What else can we do?
Yeah. So again, I think there are some things which can potentially be done. Other universities around the world do, which is to run programs, for the industry, for governments, which are very niche programs. They could be executive education programs or, like an MBA and so on. But I know other institutions like the IIM, and we've spoken about this, Murli, and ISB, they do charge quite a lot, and that's a big fundraiser for them, in addition to what they raise from alumni and so on. So I think that's one mechanism that is available. But we have to be very careful over there. It should not be a mass product that's goes out to everyone. I think maintaining the quality is important. And NLS is already known for a certain brand, and I think nothing should be done that's going to affect the brand. So I think that has to be a very tricky question. It's good to launch these programs, but we have to be very careful that it's done and delivered with high quality, and also it doesn't affect the brand. And I know one other thing, I think listening to a lot of the views that were put forth, to me, I think as an institution, whether the funding comes from the government, whether the funding comes from the alumni, private institutions, whether it comes from executive education, I think the one thing we should always guard in protecting to the utmost extent as an academic, I would say that is academic freedom. So I think universities are a place, and whether it's left, right, etc., I think the ability to generate, discuss these issues. So to me, I think funding should be independent of all of these, because in the end, I think depending on whichever source it comes from, I think once we have strings attached, then I think it impinges upon academic freedom, and I think we should zealously guard against that as an academic institution.
I think, thank you very much. There were a few questions, but I think one of the interesting comments was actually made by the Vice Chancellor, who said that we potentially receive 1.7% of state funding. So in 32 years, NLS has received 16 crores from the government of Karnataka. So in terms of money, it hasn't been very much, but in terms of what the influence is for that little bit of money, it seems to be disproportionate. So I guess, one of the things to take away is SARSU would be happy to provide for, let's say, local representation if the government was paying up 350 crores, but not when it's paying up, a crore a year.
So I'll just ask one question. Is it inclusive of the land or exclusive of the land?
Exclusive of the land. The land is on long lease, which we just renewed this year.
Yeah.
From Bank
City.
So the land does not belong to us.
No, but there is additional land also, which I think has, that's what I've been informed. I don't know. There's some additional land, but anyway, anyway, so I'm just.
Yeah, we pay a nominal annual rent for this land.
Yeah.
We hope that we will be, the ideal situation would be to have land of our own that we could build on, which is close to the law school or close to the law school, because we certainly need more hostels and we certainly need other kinds of infrastructure. But as of now, this land is on long lease.
Yeah. But Vikramjit, land is irrelevant, right? Because we're not going to sell it.
No, I'm not saying that.
Frankly,
I'm just saying that I think people would be willing to contribute. But as I'm saying, as in the larger the contribution, you'll have to. What is that word? He who pays the piper calls the tune.
Oh yes.
Yes. So that's how it is. So. And then with whichever way you like, I think I don't think there should be any clampdown on freedom, academic freedom, but nonetheless, there should be some sort of institutional. There should be a perception that the institution is to that extent balanced. No one expects that out of students, and no one expects that out of the academic discussion. But there should be balance in the way institution handles various different points of view. But that perception is not. I'm not saying in this case, I'm not talking about the present administration. Don't get me wrong. It's not personal. But that's because I think the present administration has been quite balanced. So I'm not going into that. But there is the general perception across the board that the institution, and I'm not talking about the academic output. People are entitled to whatever views they have. But that seems to be not accommodating enough of all points of view. I think that needs to be.
So I think what we'd like to tell you is that please get us the 350 crores and we will accommodate all viewpoints in the National Law School. Sarsu, that's the message to the Additional Solicitor General.
I think that's stretching it a bit. No, I would say that, we have struggled hard to remain at the top for so long, despite, all these financial constraints. And we need that money if we want to maintain our edge. I hate to say it, but we do need it. Where else are we going to get faculty from? How else are we going to support research if we don't have funding? So all the ranks that, the Karnataka government proudly says we have NIRF rank and everything else will all collapse if we are not adequately funded. And we live in a time when we are competing not just with other national law schools, but with private universities who have no dearth of funding. And that's a reality that I think as alumni, we should keep in mind.
Mr. Banerjee, you still haven't made any commitments,
No, I am not a person to, I fill in for someone who could have made a commitment, but because at the end of the day, it's a state university, I was asked to fill in at the last moment, but so I put in a point of view. I am not in a position to make the commitment.
No, I meant as in, what will it take for senior members of the bar to write checks?
But I think we've had this discussion. I think all of us know that this discussion had happened. So there is nothing to see. The fact is, the state will have certain concerns. The state has concerns, and I don't want to make it explicitly, I don't want to say it explicitly, but it does have a concern largely about local representation. It has a concern about largely local representation, and it wants the accessibility of the National Law School, of the expertise which the National Law School has across the board to a wider amount of people. State's concern, whatever I could gather, was very, very specific. And it's not about, I just made that point about ideology as a side issue, but the state's concern is very, very specific. It wants maybe more people to be taught at the National Law School, and so and local representation. So to that extent, whether the National Law School is willing to do that, and how much of it is willing to concede, that's also for the National Law School to decide. I'm no one to decide, and I'm no one to decide on either of these scales, because I don't control neither the purse strings or the decision-making authority. But that's how it is, and we've discussed it. It's not that this fact hasn't been discussed. This has been discussed. It's been back and forth. It's on the table. It's not new. I am sure Sarasu knows that this is not new what I'm saying. Both these issues are not new. But whether National Law School wants to do that or wants to remain a good institution, elite institution of 70 people, catering to these wonderful law firms and in India and all over the world, that's for National Law School to decide. And then if that is the model, then I think students should be willing to pay a large amount of money for that.
Well,
because
I think
in litigation, I'll tell you, Murli, in litigation, how many people have joined litigation, except my batch? And I give great credit to my batch. But beyond that, how many batches, how many people have joined litigation? The bar set it up. How many people have joined litigation? So if you are going to send people, to largely to institutions abroad, whether it be academic institutions or commercial institutions or whatever nature, then people should pay their way, and at an exorbitant price. It can't be that you can't have a model. IITs may have been possible at that point of time where you could have sent people all over the world, but I don't think in a law school, people are willing to pay. You should be. If you're going to get a job in Chicago at a huge premium after graduating out of National Law School and getting that degree in LLM from a fancy law school anywhere, then you should be willing to pay.
May I just?
I think we'll have to stop.
All right.
Yeah. I know, Sarsu. Okay, last word.
Sarsu.
Okay, I don't think Vikramjit, you're completely right in all that. I mean, you're just looking at the BA LLB program and a small portion of it. I think if the program has diversified, when you look at the career choices that students make, when you look at our other programs, if you're looking at LLM, most people are here, they're teaching in other places. If you look at the MPP program, they I think those students contribute a lot, to the kinds of roles that you're looking for. And if you look at our distance education program, they're drawn from everywhere. And if you look at our research centers, a lot of them work with government, whether it is drafting laws or reviewing laws or, coming up with policy or training government. So to say that we are, just catering to a small group of people is, completely not correct. It never was ever in law school's history, and it definitely is not true today.
Well, I think we're going to have this discussion for a very long time. I think we'll have to call it an end, at least for now, on this. I'm sure there'll be other discussions, and I thank the Alumni Association. It's a thankless job to organize these things. And perhaps it was painful for a few people to listen to all of us go on some of the issues that we're aware of. We've discussed, I think, informally for a very long time. But I thank the Vice Chancellor and the Registrar for listening to what the alumni have to say. I hope we've made a start with some questions and some answers. And I think the idea of this webinar was to try and connect the institution back with the alumni. There has been somewhat of a strange relationship that nobody's been able to explain between the institution and the alumni. And perhaps now is the time with some of the alumni now in charge of the institution to reconnect with the Alumni Association, listen to what the alumni can do, and make the place a little less hostile for the alumni. I think that's the impression a lot of us got when we've been visiting campus. I had a terrible time trying to offer a course that nobody wanted. I think there are a few others as well who well-meaning alumni who try to offer courses which we thought would be helpful to students starting off their careers. But clearly the environment was not conducive to, so perhaps the chance when alumni will be more welcome on campus. And that's a chance to build the institution beyond just a library or a hostel. So thank you so much. I hope we'll raise some money. We'll make Sarsu happy. But also that there'll be a new model. I think that was the idea, that can we think of a new model? Can we think of what it will take to build that model? What is that infrastructure and how do we fund it? This is just the initiation of the conversation. I hope we have many more of these, and I hope that we will come with some answers very soon. Thank you all very much. And can I please hand back to whoever is moderating the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Murli.
Mani, we can start the next panel.
Thanks, Rupa. I was just confirming that with Sachin also. Our next panel is on diversity and inclusion, both within and outside the classroom. This panel will be moderated by Mr. Sachin Malhan, who is the co-founder of Agami. He is a 2002 graduate who co-founded Law School Tutorials and Rainmaker/Vahura, and led the Change Makers program of the global nonprofit Ashoka. Over to you, Sachin.